You can't wait on their affirmation. You can't wait on their approval. You can't wait on their support. Sometimes you just got to run and look behind you and say, everybody who wants to run, run, but I can't stop running because you're not running with me. Listen to me, hear me. You can't stop chasing your dream just because somebody in your life won't chase it with you. You can't stop believing in yourself just because somebody in your life won't believe in you. You can't stop chasing the dreams of your life just because when you know when you do it, you're going to have to do it all by yourself.
call me up when you're sober, when you showered and changed. You give it up like it's over, but never give it away. And I don't wanna fall for you this time. I can't find the truth in all the lies. If I could, I would, believe me, if I
Hello everyone, can everyone hear me? You all look amazing. Welcome, welcome to Google Ireland. So when you walked in the doors of the Foundry, you walked into our front door. That's the front door, the very beating heart of Google. This is a space for very creative things to happen and fantastic collaboration to take place. My role here tonight is to just welcome you, but I'll say a little bit about who I am. So I head up the community affairs here for Google Ireland, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you, the community, and particularly our partners. So who's here today in terms of our partners? We have Dublin Pride. We have, did I hear a woo? We have Irish Queer Archive. We have ACID, HIV Ireland, GCN, and of course, very dear to my heart, Pride at Google. So this collaboration is incredible. This is what we want, and we want more of this. And I foresee great 2024 coming up. I'm being warned anyway. We see great things happening. But last year, I got to meet the most incredible woman, Rebecca Talon de Havilland, who works for HIV Ireland, and she has opened up my eyes, my mind, my heart to many things. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel tonight. I'm not going to keep you. I'm going to hand you over now to Stephen O'Hare and Jeff Dowling.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you very much. I think I mic'd up anyway, so I don't need to. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm really delighted and honoured to have been asked to kick off what should be a really interesting evening as we talk about Monument to a Plague. I want to say thanks to Tony Walsh, and we're going to say thanks to Tony Walsh a lot, I imagine, tonight. And not just for tonight, but for quite a lot of things that Tony has done over the years. I wanted to talk a little bit about the monument, just to start us off, have a little think about this. I'm fortunate to have been on the committee who had to think about this monument, where it was going to be, what it was going to, the orientation, you know, which piece was going to be selected to be the monument, although that wasn't me and I wasn't involved in that particular decision. But it was decided in a committee that was headed up by the Department of the Taoiseach. And they took this initiative and they ran with it this year and last year. And here we are, days away from the launch and the unveiling of this wonderful monument in the Phoenix Park called Enclosed Loop. And when you see it, I think you'll be as impressed and as awestruck as I have been as that process has unfolded. But I am a small person standing on the shoulders of giants who are standing on the shoulders of mammoths who have blazed the trail from the AIDS crisis and the unfolding of HIV and HIV in Ireland to now, when we are actually going to honour and remember and recall and reflect on the legacy of this virus, of HIV and indeed AIDS. And it just got me thinking about all of the people around the world who have fought for these things and all of the times they have been successful in unveiling a monument, in having a space, in having a place, and all of the times that came before that when people lobbied for and demanded and harassed and harangued and said, we need to remember, otherwise we risk forgetting. And when you work in HIV Ireland and you work doing the work that we do, we see that forgetting can take place, and people don't recall, what things were like before. We know that HIV has changed. It has been changed by human endeavour, by the incredible advances that have been made. A person who is undetectable cannot pass on the virus. It is untransmittable. That's the best news in the world, and it has changed everything about HIV. But that said, you can't stop thinking about, you can't stop remembering, recalling, and having a place to, focus on, to ensure that we remember what we should be remembering, which is those we have lost, those that have been impacted by HIV, and those who have blazed that trail. And some of those people are here tonight who have blazed that trail and are still blazing that trail. And so I'm thinking of people who are going to join us on stage, and particularly my colleague Erin Nugent, who has been with our organisation since almost the very beginning, working with the community of people living with and dying as a result of HIV and AIDS, and the impact that has on communities. And there are many other community organisations who are represented on the panel, on the committee that the government had assembled. The last thing I would really say is what's happening on Sunday is an unveiling, and it's a moment in time when the leader of the country will stand and reflect and pause and talk about HIV and AIDS and memorialising and erecting a monument to that. And that's an absolute moment of celebration. But it's just the beginning. That monument will stand as a point in time, as a place to, as Peter Staley would say, or as Larry Kramer would say, to break the stigma, to break the silence. So if you're passing by the People's Park and you see this 5 or 6 metre tall monument, I'm hoping that it will break the silence that still persists. And more than that, I'm hoping that it will break the stigma that still persists, and that people will talk about HIV and AIDS. And not only will they remember, but they will ask questions about it and ask what's happening now and where are we now and where are we going with this. And that is my great desire for this monument. And I think everybody in HIV Ireland is working towards ending stigma and ending new transmissions of the virus by the end of the decade. But more than that, in honouring and reflecting and connecting with and being there for members of the community of people living with HIV. So that's why I'm here today. Thank you for that, listening to me in those few words. I want to, if I can, introduce a man, for many people who need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway, Mr. Jed Dowling of Dublin Pride.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Google, for the invite. Tony asked if I might maybe say a word or two about the importance of symbols, and in particular some of the early attempts we made at having monuments. So I don't know if you know, we have a tree down in Merrion Square. If you stand by Oscar Wilde's statue, to the side there's a tree and there's a plaque commemorating people who were victims of violence, of abuse, and those who lost their lives because of AIDS over the years. It's one of the early ones. But the thing is, it's actually time, because at this exact minute, on this exact day, 45 years ago, Dan White walked into a room and shot Harvey Milk. This exact minute. The timing could not have been more coincidental. For those of you who don't know, Harvey Milk, a few months beforehand, he was very well known as one of the first LGBT politicians. He went to his friend Gilbert Baker, and he foresaw that in this new emerging LGBT rights movement, there was a need to come up with something to unite everyone. We weren't called Pride back then. That was coming. It was on its way. So he challenged Gilbert Baker to come up with something to unite the community. And that year, 45 years ago, the Pride flag was created. The power of symbols can never be underestimated, the impact that it has on other people. In her inauguration speech, Mary Robinson said that symbols give us our identity, our self-image, our way of explaining ourselves and to others, and that symbols in turn determine the kind of stories we tell, and the kind of stories we tell determine the kind of history we make and remake. We're living proof within the Pride movement of the power of a symbol. In a world filled with war, with all sorts of horrible things, it's always worth reminding yourself that last June, more people marched under our flag than have marched in any army in the history, well, in the history of history. Symbols change the world. So this is not just another monument in Dublin. It's something that has the power to change history. And for everyone who's been involved in it, on behalf of Dublin Pride, we're happy that we were able to, in some small way, contribute towards it. But you should all be proud of yourselves. You didn't just make history, you remade it. Thank you.
I need to put on my phone a timer because everybody who knows me knows I just overtalk. So I am really sticking to 15 minutes here, okay? Stopwatch timer. Here we go. Oh, cancel. How do you do a timer? You see, I don't even know how to use a timer. How bad is that? Great. Hello, everyone. I can't see you all, but you have no idea how much it means to me and the team behind tonight to have your company. And I know in the audience there are people who are representative of all of the stakeholders involved in HIV and AIDS advocacy over the last 41 years. And people, as Stephen has already said, people who've been fighting the good fight right since the very beginning. I'm thinking of the Irish Haemophilia Society. I'm thinking of Gay Health Action. I'm thinking of the members of the government's National AIDS Strategy Committee, which came about in the late 90s, and many other people. And you're all very, very welcome. It's really important that we do our own bit to not only mark World AIDS Day. Not everyone can get together on the 1st of December, but not only can we do something to mark World AIDS Day in our own way, but get together and have important conversations, which is really what tonight is about. And again, as Stephen and Jed said, consider how we put a value on the National HIV AIDS Monument that's going to be unveiled next Sunday. Now, I was going to give you a 15-minute, and I'm already 2 minutes into it, a 15-minute roller coaster history of the Irish AIDS pandemic, and I realized I couldn't do it. So dial down your expectations right now. No, really dial them down. I couldn't do it. We started organizing this event 6 weeks ago, and thank you very much everyone at Google for stepping up to the mark and making it happen and realizing it in such a gorgeous fashion and emotional fashion tonight. But I realized when I was going about it, and I'm sort of 1 foot in the past, scanning old documents and reading through old press and getting really upset and angry, and having to consider that I've been carrying, like lots of people who lived through, I'm 62, who lived through the AIDS pandemic, I'm still carrying a little bit of anger. I'm still carrying some grief, and I suppose trauma as well about that. We're going to talk about that later on. But I also realize it's almost impossible in 15 minutes to give you a history of the Irish AIDS pandemic, because it is so complex, it's so contested, and also too, and again we're going to talk about this more, there are myriad archives that are not and documents and reservoirs of documents that are just not in the public domain that need to be. And this is one of the values I hope, one of the key points I hope you'll take away from tonight is the pressing urgency to actually archive, digitize, document, a testimony to the pandemic. And the AIDS pandemic is not over. To actually document all that stuff and put it out there for the benefit of the Irish public, put it out there for broadcasters, put it out there for academics, put it out there for journalists, because it isn't there. And there are myriad. There's the Dublin Diocesan Archive, for example. The Roman Catholic Church is an extraordinary archive, which they're brave enough also manages to probably shame them, if they read between the lines, shame them of their dereliction of duty. Ditto the government. We've got the archives of HIV Ireland. We've got extensive archives, HIV and AIDS archive in the Irish Queer Archive in the National Library of Ireland, not in the public domain. And I welcome the attendance of members of the National Library here tonight, but we need to ask the question, well, where's the money? Where's the urgency? Where's the significance of actually organising all of that material? Digitising the quilts, the extraordinary quilts that you've seen outside, which, there's no digital copies of, and, they need to be preserved and everything. So what I want to do is actually just go back very quickly and set the tone for the conversation we're going to have later on, and remind ourselves of a place, this is around the late 70s. I'm liking Ireland to an almost feudalistic environment where conversations around birth control were just non-existent, extraordinary. There was no such thing as, STIs were called VD, venereal disease. Euphemistically, what were they called euphemistically? Special clinics or something. And there were 4 places in Dublin where you could actually go and get a HIV test. It just simply wasn't part of our conversation. It was quite extraordinary. So you can imagine, what I want to do is actually imagine the place that we found ourselves in as AIDS reached our door. And when you think back to that time, the early 80s, you look back at disenfranchised, the early demographics affected by HIV and AIDS, injecting drug users from socially deprived urban centres around Ireland, not just in Dublin, gay and bisexual men, haemophiliacs, and sex workers, most people marginalised for one reason or another, and having to actually bear the burden of extraordinary levels of social opprobrium and stigma and othering. And into that situation, we have this brand new pandemic. Well, it wasn't a pandemic at that stage. And except for people who've lived through COVID, maybe you can get an understanding of what it might have been like, a little understanding. We didn't have lockdowns. We're lucky that we could go about our way, but it was still something different. I want to give you a flavour of some of the press reportage from the time. Fear, ignorance, shame and stigma have shaped public discourse on HIV and AIDS in Ireland since the very first formal diagnosis of infection in 1985, when 8 full-blown cases were reported, of which 5 of those 8 had already died. And prior to this year, there were no diagnosed cases. The term AIDS was coined in 1982, and by 1983, HIV had been isolated in France and would be named as HIV, the virus would be named as HIV in 1986. And within a few years, according to one Irish gay rights activist, quote, all of us will know someone who has died as a result of this disease, when there was just simply no cure. A combination of cultural and political factors, not least the, I can't go back, can I? No? A combination of cultural and political factors, not least the illegality of contraceptives, criminalisation of gay male sex, censorship of sexual health information, and a rigid Catholic morality informed official attitudes to the disease throughout most of the 1980s and into the 1990s. The first public information leaflets were produced by a group of volunteers who formed Gay Health Action, and I'm delighted to welcome some of those founders here tonight. The first HIV AIDS advocacy group were a bunch of gay men and lesbian women who decided we need to address the issue in our midst. And not only were they producing information for their own community, our own community, they were producing information for worried heterosexuals in the face of a government that just simply absolved itself of any sort of responsibility for several years. Within 2 years, Gay Health Action had produced a series of information leaflets. They produced a series of information leaflets aimed at the entire population and rolled out a range of practical services such as a body positive group and a counselling service called Carja. In 1986, AIDS Action Alliance, an umbrella group of 9 organisations working right around the country, was established. And that same year, 1986, that the AIDS Action Alliance is founded, HIV is given a name. 21% of the cases that year were IV drug users. They were a significant demographic. It's quite extraordinary. and something we need to come back and actually address later on. Why was that the case? And would be the case for several years afterwards. In 1987, Dr. Fiona Mulcahy was appointed the first consultant in sexually transmitted diseases at St. James's Hospital. Its much lauded Guy Clinic, which Dr. Mulcahy helped establish, is now the largest of its kind in Ireland and continues to play a research role in sexual health. Essentially, Dr. Fiona Mulcahy and her peers dragged GU medicine out of the dark ages and started the process of trying to destigmatize and de-shame going for a sexual health checkup, which should be as ordinary and everyday as going to visit your dentist, and that's painful as well, actually. So I want to look at defining resilience. I want to actually take a moment to look at how we then responded to the unfolding catastrophe in our midst. These organizations, voluntary-run organizations with no funding. How am I doing for time? My timer says 15:50. Oh God, whatever. Oh, great, thank you. Super. God bless Google and their technology. 5 years after the first cases of AIDS were reported, the Oireachtas, the government, the Parliament, held its first Dáil debate on AIDS in 1989. Shocking. Well, the same thing happened in the USA. Reagan, it took 5 years for Reagan, the president of the USA, to actually mention the word AIDS. 5 years after the first diagnosed cases, when we have a worried, frantic population with as you've probably seen, did we run through some of the press reportage? Well, you've seen some of the scaremongering press reportage. A worried, frightful population, not unlike some of the things that played out during COVID. And people looking for information and worrying where they're going to be next and what sort of testing facilities there are. 5 years afterwards, the Oireachtas finally had a conversation. And even then, it was hobbled by the prevailing religious morality of the country. Condoms were still illegal. The church, even faced with the reality of people dying from this disease, this infection, if they couldn't actually get access contraceptives, we're prepared to say, no, we're not going to actually we're not going to condone the use of condoms. At a time when the government was tinkering with legislation around condom availability. It started that process in 1979, and throughout the 80s, possibly, I would argue, in response to the unfolding pandemic, they decided, okay, we'll make it okay for married couples with a doctor's prescription to go and get a condom from a chemist. So the only place throughout the early days of the AIDS pandemic, the only place you could get a condom was in a chemist or a health centre, and if you're over 18, with a doctor's prescription. It's quite extraordinary. Not a reason to be angry, but anyway, I'll let that pass. The year after the the Irish Parliament had that essential conversation, the Irish Family Planning Association produced a documentary about people living with HIV and AIDS called Stories from the Silence. Screened on RTE, it was later released as an educational video. And then a National AIDS Strategy Committee is finally established. 1990, Virgin Megastore is fined for selling condoms and breaking those laws that I just spoke about. And they would go on, they would be dragged to court, fined, and go back and go, no, we have a public duty, we have a moral duty, we have an ethical duty to sell condoms, and continue doing it, and continuously break the law for, I think, 3 or 4 years in a row. Here's some of that reportage I'm talking about and the difficulty that people had. The contested conversations, even the language, the terminology that was contested. AIDS sufferers as victims, as passive victims, as opposed to people who are living with AIDS. And many of you will recall one of our major public figures, the Diceman Tom McGinty, a beloved street performer, actually going on, only a few months before he died, going on national television and talking about living with AIDS, knowing that it was a death sentence, but living with AIDS. And owning, with great dignity and fortitude, owning his health status in a way that government and other agencies in the country were trying to deny him and other people in his situation. On the cusp of the septic tiger, in 1993, sex between men was finally decriminalised. Condoms were no longer defined as contraceptive. thus facilitating the launch of a Department of Health media campaign advocating condom use as a defence. Finally, 10 years after the first case of HIV, the Department of Health decided to allow and admitted that condoms would actually be really good barrier against a defence against HIV transmission. By the year's end, there were over 400 cases of AIDS and more than 1,500 people affected with HIV at a time when the mortality rates was about 51%. And at that stage, in 1993, men who had sex with men and IV drug users were the two largest cohorts. A tragedy of mounting deaths wreaked havoc on the newly liberated LGBT community, cutting down friendships, new families and associations, but also wreaking havoc amongst drug-using communities who were all hugely marginalised and hugely othered by their peers in society, who just simply didn't want to engage with the questions of why there were high rates of infection amongst injecting drug users, and also how our conversations around safe rooms for people to inject was a hugely problematic and contested issue, and would remain so throughout most of the 1990s. As I said, I'm going to do a roller coaster here. How am I? What time am I? Building a place of memory. Well, I'm nearly there. About 2 or 3 more minutes. The arrival of HAART, highly active antiretroviral treatment, in 1996 gave new hope to HIV positive people, ultimately leading to a decline in AIDS deaths. And you can see at the time also the beginning of some significant cultural responses to the place that we found ourselves in. I'm thinking of Alternative Miss Ireland that I was involved in, which was a huge cookie arts drag pageant in the Olympia Theatre. But for all of its 18-year history, it would raise significant amounts of money for people living with HIV and also people affected by AIDS. This is before and in the lead up to antiretroviral therapies. At the time, filling the gap left by government, providing comfort for people. Before anti-discrimination legislation arrived in 2000, where people were actually sacked from their jobs for being HIV positive, we forget about all of that. Providing comfort to people to help them pay their rent, practical support for people who were fired from their jobs, who actually had diminished self-esteem. All of that sort of stuff was really important. Not only offer practical support, then also find ways to fund psycho-emotional supports as well. 2007, we had the Stamp Out Stigma campaign. In 2009, Jimmy Golding wins a landmark case with the Equality Authority on HIV discrimination. And if you jump forward a little later, in October 2015, we see the launch of the first ever sexual health strategy for Ireland, where Leo Varadkar, the Minister for Health at the time, was on hand to announce several new welcome plans for sexual health services in Ireland. And maybe we'll actually, if we have time, our Q&A later, we'll talk about how that plan worked out from 2015, when almost 10 years later. Really interesting, before I finish, is to sort of think about, just throw some stats out at you. In 1990, there were 12 AIDS deaths in Ireland in 1990. 10 years later, in 2019, there were 9 deaths. AIDS hasn't gone away. That's a decline of 25%. We need to ask ourselves, why is that case? Why is that the case? Why are people still dying of AIDS in Ireland? Why are people still dying of AIDS anywhere? And we're going to hear about why people are dying of AIDS in the Global South, for example, but it just shouldn't be happening with the advent of antiretroviral therapies, improved information strategies. Why is that the case? And we should be angry, and we should actually be asking those important questions of why we allow it to happen in this day in 2023. Talking about 2023, the most recent stats from HIV Ireland show there were 884 new diagnoses out of a cumulative total since 1983 of close to 10,000. And there's actually, the good news is there's actually a decrease in new diagnoses, but there are actually an increase of people presenting with infections, people who've actually arrived in Ireland. And that's really important that we actually take a moment to consider how is that happening. It's things like, for example, nobody thinks about this, the war in Ukraine is disrupting health services. We have loads of Ukrainians actually arriving on our shore, some of them discovering that they're HIV positive when they arrive here. In some cases, not discovering that when they go for a HIV test, not only are they HIV positive, they've got full-blown AIDS. And in some cases, no amount of medical intervention is going to help them, and they're dead a few months later. I mean, this isn't a total grim story, but these are things we need to fess up to. We need to ask ourselves, and it's important to also consider the position of new Irish, the position of immigrants, the people who are arriving here, because you know what, back in the early days of the AIDS pandemic, there were people who were jumping at every opportunity to blame AIDS as some sort of foreign import. Just put it on someone else. Find some easy target and go, oh, it's those people. It's the blacks, or it's somebody from Eastern Europe or whatever. So we need to be mindful of that type of discourse that can so easily take root, and ensure that that's not the case. What else do I need to say here? Oh yes, and the other thing which I hope we're going to hear more about is, since 2018, we've also started reporting new HIV infections amongst trans men and women. That's really important as well, because actually trans men and women present with a whole host of different health concerns as well. And again, too, that needs to be part of sort of wider public discourse around how we design health information, health education, health services. I'm not going to say anything more, because really this is all about the panel. So can I just invite you all to come up, please? Great. So, delighted you're all here. Right beside me here is Dr. Pádraig Kerrigan. He's an assistant professor in the School of Information and Communication Studies at UCD, University College Dublin. His first monograph, LGBT Visibility, Media and Sexuality in Ireland, was released in January 2021 with Routledge, and he co-authored Media Graduates at Work, Insider Narratives on Policy, Education and Industry. It was published with Palgrave in July 2021. Currently, he's co-principal investigator on a project called Waking the Hirschfeld, an oral and archival history of Dublin's LGBT Community Centre, and it's a collaboration with the National Museum of Ireland and Liverpool University Press, and I'm delighted that you're here. Next to Pádraig is Erin Nugent. Dr. Erin Nugent manages HIV Ireland's community support services, and she's worked in the HIV field for over 30 years, when HIV Ireland was known as Dublin AIDS Alliance. When did you change your name? 2015, was it? 2017? Yeah. So Erin came to Dublin AIDS Alliance as a volunteer in 1992, and she has a Master of Education degree from UCD and a PhD in sociology from Trinity College Dublin. And I love the title of her doctoral thesis, Vigilantes. I mean, it's like honey to a bee here. Her doctoral thesis, Vigilantes, explores anti-drug movements and community empowerment, a Dublin case study which examines the trajectories of Dublin's inner city anti-drug movement over 2 decades. Major piece of ethnographic work, actually, in social anthropology, I would suspect. I'm dying to read it, actually. A bit selfish of you not to bring it tonight, actually. Could have signed it as well. And her interests include, of course, street ethnography, peer mentoring, and community-based social movements and responses, which we are going to be talking about lots tonight, I feel. Chipo Harper grew up in Zambia, a Dubliner who grew up in Zambia, now lives in Ballantyre, and she has a Master's in Public Health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and has experience in delivering really important mobile HIV testing and working with families and those with HIV in Zimbabwe. Chipo now works with Assets Project Migrant Plus, supporting communities from a migrant background in Dublin in overcoming barriers to health inclusion, including in partnership with HIV Ireland's new mobile testing van, which is called Check and Chat. And of course, she's also a trained anti-racism trainer through the Irish Network Against Racism. Thank you very much for joining us. Next to Chipo is Richard Carson, who leads leads ACID. ACID is AIDS care and education, and not unlike HIV Ireland, has had skin in the game for 30 odd years as well. One of the oldest NGOs of its kind in the country. ACID's quilt group, which you probably saw, did you all get to see the quilt selection earlier on as you were coming in? ACID's quilt group is the longest running memory project on HIV and AIDS in Ireland, and it meets almost fortnightly since 1993. He's got qualifications in a wide range of issues, including pharmacology, education, management of community, ministry and mission. And your prize-winning master's dissertation, another one you should have brought in to sign, from Trinity College, is on HIV prevention and research on race, place and memory. Perfect time. You should have had copies for everyone in the audience. We're talking about memory here. Yes, so we're going to try and make room for some Q&A afterwards, okay? So make a mental note if there's a question you want to ask any of the audience any of the panel or all of the panel, please keep that in mind. Pádraig, I want to come to you first. Your book on LGBT visibility, media and sexuality pulls no punches in critiquing the print and broadcast media reportage throughout the AIDS pandemic. We weren't well served, were we?
Definitely not. I mean, and even just looking at the slides that you have here, the reportage that you've included, it's kind of shows to me two things that are at work. And it's kind of what I call in the book this tug of war, whereby you have this severe public health need that the gay community realizes very quickly, actually. My goodness, the government is not actually going to do anything about this. They're going to sit on their hands and their wallets, and we now have to actually take some sort of responsibility here in terms of taking ownership on a number of grounds, developing a response to this pressing public health need, but also what we're seeing is an actual, what I refer to in the book as a war of representation beginning to break out within the media itself. Because the media is what actually begins to peddle really problematic narratives with regards to AIDS being entangled with shame and stigma. The very first mention of AIDS on a broadcast forum was 1983, Today Tonight. And Today Tonight is a very checkered history of doing very salacious things in terms of, I mean, I'll get to the public bathroom bit in a second, very problematic. But in 1983, Hillary Orpin opens the show AIDS, and then this big imprint on these gay men in California. Immediately, already you have this association with gay men, and already in the current affairs broadcasting, you see it becomes completely embroiled in gay sexuality, entirely, and to a lesser extent, intravenous drug users. But immediately you have sexuality interconnected with this. And you see this becoming really problematic as the crisis develops, and in particular when Rock Hudson passes from an AIDS-related illness in 1984. That's when you see the coverage completely spike. Roger Streitmatter, a US academic, said that reportage in the US increased by 607% the day after Rock Hudson died. And all of it was completely circulating narratives of shame and stigma. But Today Tonight became really salacious in their production culture, in that they went to the Keys, Berg Key, with this camera under a jacket, and they were kind of going, this is where many of Ireland's sex workers, rent boys is what they were using actually at the time. This is where many of Ireland's rent boys have caught AIDS and spread it around the city to Ireland's gays. It's like these really problematic narratives of shame and stigma, trying to attach it to particular community groups. So this is kind of what you see in the 1980s beginning to circulate exponentially, really problematically. And I know we're kind of talking about the 80s here, but I was talking with Tony about this on Friday. And I kind of mentioned something that happens in the late 1990s, and Tony was quite appalled and wanted me to share it with you. So in the late 1990s, Irish soap opera Fair City had made very much a big deal of a character, Owen Healy, coming out as gay in 1996. We all are very familiar with it from reeling in the ears, the not so sexy kiss that doesn't actually happen. There's a whole story behind that I have, but I won't share it for today. But a number of years later, a character comes into the show called Simon Lennon. Simon is kind of an Oscar Wildean, Foppian theatrical individual that's come from London and immediately comes to Carrickstown with full-blown AIDS, not just AIDS, full-blown AIDS. So this becomes like a really significant thing, and essentially, while antiretroviral therapies were widely circulating in Ireland from 1996, here we have in 1999 the public service broadcaster on a soap opera, which at the time had a relatively good audience of 700,000 an evening, substantial audience, saying, if you get AIDS in Ireland, you will die. There are no options for you. So that storyline resolved itself by Simon essentially saying, yeah, can you help me take my own life? So AIDS becomes entangled with assisted suicide. There are no options for me. There is no treatment. And this is the message that our public service broadcaster wanted to put out there. What was really salacious about that was, and my colleague Cormac O'Brien in his research in UCD has covered this in conversations he's had in an academic paper he has, the scriptwriters consulted with the clinic at St. James's, and St. James's literally said, do not do that. That is going to send the worst message. We need people coming through our doors for treatment. If you broadcast that, we are terrified this is going to cause people to be fearful of coming in, because they will just think this is AIDS apocalypticism. They're just going to inevitably die. So what's the point of getting treatment? So this is the power that media had. And I'm kind of telling that story because that's 1999, you know? And I think this is kind of something we're seeing to the present day. There's a thread here in terms of the shame and stigma that begins in 1983 that carries all the way through. And the last kind of thing I'll say to that is the gay community is left with the responsibility of responding to that through the very little means that they had. The likes of Tony, Gay Health Action, really senior members there having to canvass the red tops, hold them to account, and then develop their own media through the likes of Out Magazine. Out Magazine from issue 4 has AIDS reportage and stays at the front line of developments that are happening. Literally in issue 6, I think it was, tells Irish gay men, here's how you put on a condom, despite the fact that they weren't freely available. So there's this tug of war that's happening consistently around cultural representation. It's a volatile site that I think resulted in a significant amount of damage at the time. So that's kind of just one of the many things that I'm sure we'll kind of riff off.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment, but I also want to, hopefully we'll have time to actually revisit the idea of the sort of circular nature of a lot of public narrative, this public reporting by the media, and what's actually driving some of that, whether it's just sort of bald stigma and bigotry that you describe or something else, particularly because you'd imagine that after there'd be a sea change of public attitudes after the advent of antiretroviral therapies and just better educated populations. Erin, I want to go to you because you've got a long history, as I said earlier on, of engagement with Dublin's inner city drug-using communities. Their experience of the pandemic has differed hugely from other demographics, I'm sure you'd agree. Like, for example, as Porrick's been describing, much different there. Would you agree their experience of the pandemic has been much different from, for example, gay and bisexual men or haemophiliacs? And I'd love to know what are those key differences, and has there been much of a change in the intervening years?
Okay, so when I came in in 1992 as a volunteer, and there were some similarities with the communities. One of the things that was really, I guess something that really stood out to me was how there were in the communities of people who were injecting drugs and the gay community, there was the unwell caring for the very sick. And I had never seen anything like that before. Probably maybe in war movies, you know, where somebody wounded is carrying somebody else who's just got shot, you know. And it was extraordinary to kind of witness, and very touching, obviously very poignant. What I remember of that time of the community of people who use drugs is that gay men, like Tony, right, were losing friend after friend after friend. The community of people who were using drugs were losing friend after friend after friend. They were losing sibling after sibling after sibling. There's a family in the North Inner City where 6 of the siblings died of AIDS-related illnesses back in the early 90s. They were losing their parents. Children were becoming orphaned. And so it was quite different, I think, for that community. And I think there was a response I think they wanted a response, but they just didn't know how to go about responding. And so they were kind of jockey backing, I think, on the work of gay men. So we would see a lot of people who use drugs who would come into Dublin AIDS Alliance, who would sort of be kind of hanging around trying to kind of see what was going on in the gay community to try and get like a foothold, I think, in some kind of activism. But it was still very difficult because obviously if you're using drugs, you're very active in your drug use, and that just brings a whole bunch of other dynamics into your life. So the organization of people who use drugs wasn't as, for want of a better word, good as it was for.
But we had to fight for so long to just even legitimize the provision of safe spaces for people to inject, and a safe exchange of needles, for example. I mean that those issues have been contested for so long, and there's still a huge. It seems to me there's still a huge swathe of the Irish public and even the political elite who find all of that quite problematic and haven't actually joined up the dots at all and realised if we don't actually provide those resources, then we're just simply going to go back to where we found ourselves in the 80s. Richard, like Erin, you've had a long engagement with drug-using communities and Acid's Quilt Group. I didn't realise this until you told me it's the longest-running memory project on HIV and AIDS in Ireland. Will you tell us something about the genesis of the project and where it's at today?
Yeah, so in around 1992, a group of women, they had all experienced loss and grief as a result of AIDS. And as Aaron was pointing out, with injection drug use, in particular, siblings were often using, and in the case of some of the women we were working with, were dying. So in the space of a few months even, one might be burying multiple siblings and multiple of one's own children. And so we gathered some of those women in the Rialto area, the southwest inner city Dublin area, to engage in quilting, initially in the tradition of the names quilt. And some of the quilts up above are from Queer Culture Ireland's name holding of the Names Project. But after they'd initially created some quilts remembering their loved ones, I suppose what's unique about our quilt group is they kept quilting. And in a sense, they stayed in their place and kept quilting in the place.
Today, like,
in Rialto. Yeah, right up until, did they meet last week? Pretty much every fortnight, I suppose, seasonally through for 30 years. I suppose what they did was really interesting from a memory perspective, because what did they move on to remembering? In particular, the quilts that you can see up on the left at the forge. There's two quilts either side of the yellow forge sign. And they are quilts where they started not just to remember the people that they'd lost, they started to remember the place. And this was really important for how memory operates, because they were remembering, I suppose, that the stories of injustice that had embodied their experiences of loss in the place. One's to do with the Rialto area itself, and the other more broadly Dublin and their memories of Dublin as the place that it experienced growing up. There's lots of images I can pick out on that. I'll mention one, although I'll quickly mention the iconic Crumlin Shopping Centre, which gets a mention on one, because these elderly women were kicked out of Crumlin Shopping Centre for shaking a tin and saying Irish AIDS Day. So that gets a quick mention there for that moment. But another image that's really interesting on it is the unit that's at the corner of Rialto and Dolphins Barn Road. It's kind of the key business unit in the village. And so when they were growing up, this was the bank. And so they remember having maybe a savings account or their family engaging with the bank, and that sense of connection, even though banks are problematic, of course, but that sense of connection with a broader world, that the transnational, transactional reality of your place connecting with something broader. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, that bank left, and it's replaced by the thriving business of the time for that area. It's memorialised on the quilt, and it's a funeral directors. So in a sense, the funeral directors moved in. And so suddenly you shifted from this place maybe associated with connection to a place associated with the very opposite, destruction. And so they're memorialising of the funeral directors in quilts, stitching the very quilt and section that you can see up above here, is itself an act of memory. And what it does is really interesting, because it isn't just remembering their loved ones. It's inviting the viewer to remember the place and to remember the story of injustice that informed the story of AIDS in that place.
Hugely important.
That's a key shift. My fear, I guess, of the National AIDS Memorial is that we'll go forward with an ideology of our time which says smooth out everything. Just remember individuals and maybe collective groups, but know that the past is nice and smooth, and let's go from there. The past isn't smooth.
And the past
it's full
is
of ups and downs.
Still with us.
And that's the thing. It's still with us. So by making our memory spatial and not merely about people, we're invited into that. And whether you know that Rialto's over that other part of the city, whether you drive past it, or maybe you live in Dublin 8, the fact that you're in a place, because that funeral directors is still there today, it's a spatial reminder for you of the injustices that informed HIV. And it's key that our memory does that. Doesn't merely remember individuals and collectively do that, although that's very important. I got caught because I spotted a name on the screen there in terms of personal grief and connection with the family. And so that's going to be real going forward. But it's so important that, and maybe our quilts point us to this, to remember the places, and to remember that those very places that we encounter are themselves reminders of the injustices that informed HIV and AIDS, and some of them are still with us, which is like key for the theme of injecting drug use, because HIV memory operates differently in injecting drug use context. And because it's wrapped in so many other realities, some of which we've also overcome, like hepatitis C in terms of mortality, but others are still with us. And so much of the HIV memory is around other themes like drug overdose that sort of wrap around it. And this month, a week ago in this city, we have heroin drug overdoses taking place, not too far from where we're all sitting. And so we continue to have these realities with us today.
The representation, making a space for all of that multifarious representation is so important. And I want to talk to you, Chipo, ask you about this. How to Tell a Secret, the Irish documentary, which is shameless plug, is for, in fact, the producer is in the audience. Hi, Zlata. How to Tell a Secret, which is an extraordinary documentary, if you haven't seen it, is airing on Netflix on World AIDS Day, appropriate enough. And the documentary is possibly the first of its kind in Ireland that gives a rare platform to women's and minority immigrant voices who have been historically underrepresented in our HIV and AIDS discourse. And I just feel you're well placed, given the work that you do with Migrant Plus, you're well placed to sort of address some of that underrepresentation, the lack of representation. There's something really devastating about people being silenced. The alienation, the othering of a person's, the diminution of, dismissing of a person's humanity, which happens when we don't make a room for that representation. And I wonder what your thoughts on this, but it strikes me that we need to be more attuned to the lived experience and cultural needs of people with AIDS and people who are living long, successful lives with HIV. But we need to be more attuned to the lived experience of people who are not like us, who are new Irish, who are immigrants, who are whatever. And then by way of being more attuned to them, we can actually understand the sort of minefield of cultural sensitivities. There are lots of cultural sensitivities attached to trying to actually make a place for that representation, the representation of migrant voices, the representation of others who haven't been framed in the discourse. Women's voices, women's faces have been so criminally underrepresented in public discourse in Ireland around HIV and AIDS. What's your take on that?
I think it's interesting to me what your 15 minute talk that you gave earlier, and when I listened to you talking, I found striking similarities between the gay men experience and the experience of migrants in terms of not having a voice or not being acknowledged or recognized, even as people needing to be recognized as human beings. The issues may differ in terms of how they express themselves, and maybe resourcing may be different. But I still find that at the core of the experience of LGBT in terms of accessing care or having representation was this idea that if you are not a certain way, there's no place for you in this community, in this country. So in one context, it can be to do with your gender or your sexual orientation. Then yesterday, it can be about the way you look or your religious beliefs or your appearance. So I guess for me, what I think about a lot is that as a society, we can tackle issues individually and say, okay, this year we said we will tackle the issue of gay men. Then next year we'll tackle the issue of migrants. And then next year we'll tackle the issue of people who we found out there's blue people and now they're coming into, we can spend our whole lives changing the particular person or issue. But I think at the core of it is this refusal to acknowledge that different is not necessarily bad. Yeah, so that's my take on it. And I think until we can recognize that in ourselves, this desire to, this dehumanizing of anything that is not familiar. I don't really think that the issue is that people don't have a voice, or it's that, people that have the control, policymakers, people that make the rules and legislation have decided that this is what a human being is like, and everyone else has to either dance to that tune or you're out.
Hearing you say that, it reminds me that we need to up our game when it comes to how we throw at memorializing the pandemic.
Yeah.
Tools we use to actually remember.
Yeah.
And how we engage in a sort of ritual reconciliation, which is part of what we're doing here tonight.
Absolutely.
I'm cognizant that we only have about 10 minutes left, and I have a load more questions for the panel. But I really want to make this about you as well. So would anyone like to ask anyone on the panel or all of the panelists some questions? Yes, I see a hand. Great.
Sorry, John Callum.
Oh, hold on, we got a mic for you, okay?
Yeah,
I can't open it.
Sorry.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi. Right. Let's hope it's working. Yeah. Oh, there.
It's
Hi. So, something that Padraig said to me about with RTE's program and the reaction of the medical community about people not coming through the doors. This is probably adjacent to it, somewhat similar. I signed up to the Gay Men's Health Clinic in 1997, right? I was, 21, 22 at the time. And then I came back, and I was away, and I came back, and I went back into my local community in Meath, and the GP there said, and it's either to do with health insurance or life insurance or whatever, but said, don't get tested through my clinic, you have to go back up to Dublin. So I was told back then by a local regional GP, they weren't under the organisation of these health authorities. They were just sort of kind of independent back then. But this is 20 years ago. So I mean, how was the attitude? Was there a stigma within the medical community in the local level compared to the national or metropolitan areas?
I mean, excellent question, and that's been an experience that has emerged within the queer archives and also in terms of the oral histories of the people that I've spoken to, particularly with the Hirschfeld. And one such instance of that in terms of many of the people that I spoke to at the Hirschfeld. And that's kind of quite interesting in terms of what you're saying about memory, Richard, in terms of how a memorial site that we now have in the Phoenix Park could potentially risk being a site of neutralization of this, linear timeline of progress being, this really good thing. And I think in terms of queer temporalities as queer people, we always have to be really conscious of the fact that, it's not necessarily this narrative of progress. So I just think that's just something to really kind of bear in mind for ourselves, that it's constantly, I suppose that tug of war is always going to be there. But to answer your question directly, I mean, Out magazine throughout 3 issues, and this was kind of Ireland's first glossy magazine that was commercially available. I think you were in a few issues, Tony. Yeah. And one of them had the voice of a person living with AIDS, and his name was Patrick, or I think that was the pseudonym, and he actually had to send his mother to a clinic in Dublin to get his AZT because the doctor did not want him in the waiting room because the doctor perceived him as having the dreaded thin AIDS body and the sight of decaying and dying as it was perceived at the time, and therein could not be seen in the clinic because it would be so traumatic to the people of Drimna, I think it was where he was from. So his mother had to go and collect his AZT, and that is a story that's really reflective. We see that in Galway and in rural communities throughout Ireland. So it was certainly there in the metropolitan areas as well. And that's kind of the more insidious form of discrimination. Not that all discrimination is bad, but it's that kind of local form of discrimination where you're going into the doctor that you've been going to all of your life in your local town and community, and all of a sudden he has that one sentence like that where you're immediately othered. No, you can go back to Dublin for that.
And I just was asking for accessing testing.
We've time for one more question, I think. Yeah, it's Ger Philpott. Hi, Ger.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you very much for this evening. This is probably a question directed to Pádraig in particular, because you brought up the issue of the media. And I think it would be very wrong to leave here this evening thinking that the Irish media were always appalling in terms of how they dealt with HIV and AIDS and gay issues. The Irish Times, RTE, the Cork Examiner did tremendous work promoting health promotion work for HIV prevention throughout the early 90s and the late 90s. So it would be very wrong to leave with just the impression that you've given tonight. We can take the bad scenarios, and there were lots of bad scenarios, but there were lots of very, very good, positive people in the media working on our behalf and with us. So it's important to say that.
Point taken, but you could also argue, and I'm not being flippant here, that actually it was HIV AIDS advocates across various communities putting manners on a fairly wayward media as well.
But they ran with it very well.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Hi. Can we have a little thank you to Google for actually facilitating?
I'd actually like to second what Ger has said. I'm a 66-year-old man. I lost approximately, as did Tony, 20 to 30 close friends in the first 5 years of HIV and AIDS. We were supported by our political organisation, which then transformed into a health organisation. What one must realise that at the time, fear was paramount. That was the real thing. Homophobia was everywhere. We were ostracised. Then fear was paramount, so we were told that we could engage in frottage and that lesbians could use dental dams. That was the advice we got in 1982. I first heard of AIDS from a lover in Amsterdam who wrote to me from Fire Island of pneumonia. I don't recognise what I hear. There was certain stigma and shame, but for the most part, people were treated lovingly. In individual instances, families were overcome. But what was really there was fear. I remember a friend of mine telling me he had HIV, he was dying of AIDS, and he passed me his Coke can in the Hirschfeld Centre, and I took a drink from it, and he said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" It was fear. And that is really important. It was fear. And people were afraid of us. And they were afraid of us when we came out in 78. I came out in 1978, and it wasn't easy. I have friends of mine who came out in the late 60s, and it was even less easy. HIV, it killed a lot of people, but what it did do was made the state recognise us.
And could I add to that, Frank? Thank you very much for that. I would also add, as a writer, because we're almost near the end, not only did it make the state recognise all of the disaffected communities, all of the various communities, marginalised communities who were affected by HIV and AIDS, it also accelerated a lot of activism. We don't have time to explore it, but you can draw a line from the beginnings of the AIDS pandemic to the arrival of marriage equality in various countries, recognition of relationships amongst disadvantaged queer communities was actually, you could argue, was a product, or certainly accelerated product as a result of the pandemic. Sadly, we don't have, I'm just looking at the clock here, I want to actually ask you all, I'd love to have a conversation about inherited trauma, maybe for another day, because trauma rarely leaves a place, and we really do. If we're going to talk about unveiling a physical monument, we do need to have a conversation about trauma and how that plays out. maybe any journalists in the room will actually consider taking up that proposal. But very quickly before you go, if Google would just give us another 2 or 3 minutes, would love to ask each of the panel, the National HIV AIDS Memorial, which we've all been a part of actually campaigning for and agitating for the last 7 years, is being unveiled on Sunday. We heard Stephen talking about it, and I'd like to ask each of you, give a couple of minutes to addressing what you'd like to see the monument achieve. Start with you, Pádraig.
I'll keep it brief, just to answer a few questions there. I just think simply a monument is great for memorialisation, celebration. I personally think accountability and keeping things in check. That having that there is a form of ensuring good journalistic practice, for example, that we don't necessarily slip back into maybe old problematic narratives, but that we continue to maintain good practice, that we continue to learn, develop, grow, and yeah, I would say what I would consider it maybe accountability and keeping things in check.
Great, thank you for that. The legacy of an AIDS monument, Erin.
I think, like you, I would see this as the beginning of a process where we can allow people to grieve, not only for the loss of their friends, but for the loss of a lot of other things that happened for people who actually were able to survive after the medications. We're seeing more and more, particularly gay men, coming to us kind of saying that they feel lost in this particular world now because everybody's on this 1 pill a day, and, you know, shouldn't they be grateful for that now? And they just got swept up with the greatness of the new medications, and then realized that actually they hadn't had time to grieve over stuff in their lives, decisions that they had to make that they didn't want to make, and also obviously for the people they had lost. So space for grief, I'd like to see it.
Thank you for that. Chico.
I think for me, as a migrant living in Ireland, and seeing that monument going up, I think for me, I would like it to be a starting of a discourse in terms of what it is that we are remembering. Exactly how did it come to this? And I think it would be great if, as a society, we could take learnings or lessons from the pandemic of AIDS and what happened there, so that we avoid repeating the same mistakes or the same issues in our own society going forward.
That's so true. Thank you. And also, if you wouldn't mind me adding to that, reminding a wealthy country like Ireland of our duty of care and responsibility to people in the global south, to people who are coming here. Remind ourselves of our duty of care in terms of our political and cultural representation abroad, and other countries that we send development aid to and whatnot, to actually have those essential conversations. And ask the big question of why is AIDS? Well, we are. Many of you in the audience who are working at the front line of HIV advocacy and AIDS are talking about how do we get the case, how do we get the numbers down. But we do, I think sometimes too, you did touch on it, Erin, as well, that, you know, a country like Ireland who's lived through this experience, maybe actually is ahead of other countries' experience, needs to talk about, well, where are we now? And actually check our privilege and ask what can we do in terms of our relations with other countries. To finish this evening, Richard.
I think amnesia keeps us comfortable. And so I think the challenge with the memorial is to remember. And a remembering that might challenge us. You mentioned wealth. Part of the wealth division is within this city. And that wealth divides this city, and the story of HIV plays out within those divisions. And so I suppose that my hope is that a remembering will connect us to the challenge of where, I suppose, this injustice is played out in the story of HIV. I think also the challenge for Ireland in particular, with it being, it's national as in Ireland national, and we've got a particular HIV story, I suppose, with the demographics of the way injected drug use and the sort of chapters of our story that we've alluded to this evening. The connection with grief and with lament to one another, I think is going to be a challenge. It can be very easy for people to come, and as all of us will, go to a memorial with our own personal grief and even collective within certain groups. The challenge is, how will we truly come together in remembering HIV in the context of that sort of difference that Sheepa is talking about. And I know I'll label your stereotypes might do it, but it is partly that sort of difference of those who were in pockets of inner city Dublin that experienced heroin and the impact of HIV there. There's Pentecostal pastors in North County Dublin who buried their classmates from college and their family members in the 90s who are grieving for Sunday as well. And there's the story we've shared tonight around the LGBT community. So how, in all our particular complexities of Ireland, will we grieve together, I think is going to be an interesting journey to go on.
Great thought to leave everyone with. Thank you very much for that. Can I thank all of our audience here, all of our panelists, Pádraig Kerrigan, Erin Nugent, Chipo Harper, Richard Carson. And thank you. I'd love us to stay for another hour, maybe with a glass of wine as well. I'm gasping. But the other thing, what I'd love to say just to finish is I hope that some of the themes and talking points that we've touched on tonight, that you will take them to your heart. I know some of you will, many of you will, I hope you will. Take them to your heart and see how we can invest them with more agency and urgency. That's all I'll say to you as we move towards World AIDS Day and the unveiling of the monument. And thank you all again for making this such a very special evening. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Hopefully our speakers will be around for a few minutes if you want to chat with them outside as well. There we go.
Yeah, nice work.